Nothing better. Very happy to introduce Marty Hylton. Marty, come on up. Many of you are familiar with Marty. He's been working with the Sarasota School of Architecture and Hiss for a very long time. And he's a renowned historic preservationist and has just taken a very cool position that was created, I think, just for you, the National Park Service, first position for historic architecture and climate change. So Marty, welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Thank you. Great, thank you. Well, good morning. I would like to acknowledge a few people before I get started this morning. The first, of course, is Anne-Marie Russell and the staff of the newly formed Architecture Sarasota. I'm very honored to be able to be here to celebrate the indelible Phillips Hiss. This is a very bittersweet moment for me. As Anne-Marie mentioned, I recently joined the National Park Service as their first historic architect for climate change. But that was after 14 years at the University of Florida, 10 of which I was director of the Historic Preservation Program. And when I landed in Gainesville in 2007, I immediately got in my car and drove to Sarasota. No offense, Gainesville. But, and I met some amazing people, including Lorrie Muldowney, who's become a very dear friend. I've been asked over the last 2 days, like, why you? Why are you here? Why are you talking about Hiss? What many of you do know, my interest in Hiss, but what you may not know is that as a very formative 12-year-old, my parents actually rented a house for several weeks on Siesta Key and brought my brother and I down, took us out of school, and with family, I was introduced to Sarasota. And I'm a hillbilly from Holler in eastern Kentucky, so modern architecture was not something I was used to seeing. And I like to think that those few weeks in February have everything to do why I'm standing here today, why I chose to pursue architecture, my interest in school design, and my interest in cultural heritage conservation. If I think I can advance, or the next slide. What others of you may not know why I might be here today is that I'm proud to say that I was one of the instigators of a national conference of an organization called Docomomo in March of 2013. And leading into that conference, we held a public workshop. There were over 60 people involved. Lorrie, who was with the Sarasota County History Center, Janet Minker, who I think is in the audience, and Dan Snyder with Sarasota Architectural Foundation. We brought some of the founders of the Palm Springs Modernism Week. And people came together, and the whole idea of Sarasota Mod was born that day. And in 2014, it was launched, and here we are again today. If I could have the next slide. In the decades that followed the Second World War, Phillips Hiss helped transform the built environment of Sarasota as he sought to establish a new paradigm for the places where people lived and learned. For Hiss, innovative architecture was the manifestation of a progressive society, and education was the key. If I could have the next slide. My presentation today, I'm going to be a little intellectually vulnerable, if that's okay. It's been a while since I've revisited my research on Hiss, and I really embrace this opportunity, not only as the beginning and the ending chapter of my Florida time, but it allowed me to go back and to revisit some of these initial ideas. I'm going to throw out a lot of ideas just to lay the groundwork, I think, for the next two presentations about some of the concepts that really consumed Hiss throughout his lifetime. And I don't know that I have any conclusions. We'll see when we get to the end. So the presentation really explores the influences, some of the possible origins of Hiss's strongly held and interconnected convictions on education, individual freedom, the future of American society and democracy, and ultimately the kind of architecture we want to represent those ideals. So Philip Henson Hiss was born in New York City and spent his early years between Brooklyn Heights and a family home in New Canaan, Connecticut. Hiss's father and namesake came from Baltimore, Maryland. He attended Johns Hopkins University before receiving his Doctor of Medicine from Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons. Interestingly enough, in this period of our pandemic that we're living through, one of his claim to fame was developing a special media for isolating the typhoid bacillus. And he actually left for several years and worked with the New York City Department of Public Health, later returning to Columbia University. But it was Hiss's mother, Carolyn Dow Hiss, from a very wealthy and storied New York City family. Among her more prominent family members was first cousin Seth Lowe, born in 1850, died in 1916. Lowe was mayor of Brooklyn from 1881 to 1885, at a time before New York City was unified. And he really became recognized for his progressive urban reforms. He was one of the American delegates to attend the 1899 International Peace Conference at The Hague, and he was chairman of the Tuskegee Institute of Alabama from 1907 until his death in 1916. And I might return again to some issues of racial equality that I think that Hiss may have learned from his family toward the end of my presentation. However, among Lowe's many achievements, the design of a new campus for Columbia University may have been one of the greatest interests to his cousin Philip. By the way, Philip Hiss was around 6 years old when his cousin, who lived down the street in Brooklyn Heights, New York, passed away. It was Seth Lowe who oversaw the relocation of Columbia University from Midtown Manhattan to its current location in Morningside Heights. He hired renowned architectural firm McKim, Mead & White. And not only that, but he used inheritance from his father to create the Lowe Library, which is named in his honor. And like the Sarasota Public School Program and New College, the Columbia Campus Project used architecture to elevate education and educational institutions' roles in civic advancement. So I guess my argument here is that he was born with this gene to marry architecture, both innovative with innovative pedagogy. Now, although not much is known about his early education, that's Hiss, by the age of 14, he attended the nationally renowned college preparatory school Choate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Graduates of the school, of course, include, among others, President John F. Kennedy and philanthropist Paul Mellon. And despite claims made in period articles and recent scholarship about the Sarasota School and the school program, he did not graduate from Choate. Rather, for health reasons, perhaps among other reasons, he transferred to the Asheville School in North Carolina and ultimately graduated from the Hill School outside of Philadelphia. And despite attending some of the best private schools in the country, Philip Hiss never attended college. A number of factors may have contributed to his decision not to pursue a college degree. Hiss's wife, Shirley, speculated that the highly intelligent and creative Hiss was not challenged by conventional methods of learning. This may also help explain Hiss's establishment of a program for gifted students of Sarasota's public schools, one of the first major initiatives he undertook as a new board member of the Board of Public Instruction in the early 1950s. Around the time of his high school graduation, Hiss inherited a large sum of money, I believe from an uncle, and as an alternative to more traditional university education, he used his inheritance to explore various interests, amass a substantial library, and travel extensively. Hiss became, as described in a 1958 Time magazine, a self-styled Renaissance man. Hiss's views on education, in particular his promotion of experiential learning, seem to align closely with the philosophy and alternative pedagogies of John Dewey. Recognized as one of the leading educational theorists and reformers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Dewey would publish a series of articles, books, and treatises that challenged traditional academic paradigms and fundamentally transformed the basic principles and approaches to American education even to this day. Some of Dewey's guiding principles, which I think are very much mirrored in the actions and the attitudes and the writings of Philip Hiss, include school as not separate from society and culture, but a mirror of society and culture. The purpose of education, according to Dewey, and I think, again, very much echoed by Hiss, was social responsibility in the service of democracy, American democracy. Integration of community projects through service learning, emphasis on hands-on, again, experiential learning, critical thinking, problem solving, group activities. All of these things, again, I think are reflected in the life of Philpis Hiss. And perhaps one of the ultimate goals of school or education was not necessarily retaining factual knowledge, but building the social skills and instilling a lifelong love of learning. So as we heard in the video just before, Hiss set out to explore the world. First, a many-month adventure in South America, thanks to the Hiss family. They had shared with me letters that he wrote back to his mother and his aunt in New York. He was very much not a tourist, but a citizen, a global citizen. And there was a couple of interesting, he had at times a couple of companions who I think irritated him. Because they were acting a little touristy and a little bit being consumers of the local culture rather than really embedding themselves in that culture. And I think it speaks a lot to who he was as an individual. And also, as mentioned, the publication of Bali and the exhibition that was mounted in New York in 1941. That was followed shortly thereafter by his work in the Dutch Americas, the Netherlands America. And interestingly enough, you can see from these photographs, this one from St. Nicholas, Boomtown, and Caracal, but you can see in the distance there these sort of oil refineries. Well, if any of you, those of you who do know me, I get a little obsessed with my subjects. I was able to go to New York, where his photography collection is housed at the Natural History Museum. And as I was going through these, I was like, there are a lot of photographs of industrial sites and military installations. And I'm like, how did this happen? Again, this was early on in my research. Well, of course, as we all know, or I think we know, he was working with the American Office of Special Operations, the OSS, which was founded in 1946 by President Harry Truman, a precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. So he wasn't just an ethnographer, but he might have been doing a little spying for the government as well. And I believe this photograph, we don't have exact confirmation, may have been Hitler's confiscated train. He was also hired by the Department of State after World War II to help with the rebuilding of, interestingly enough, the educational system in the Netherlands or Belgium. And again, the moments that really influenced his life, his strong positions on individual freedoms and American democracy were surely influenced by the case of his older cousin, Alger, who I'm assuming, who worked for the U.S. State Department, was the one who connected him perhaps with the OSS and got him involved in government service during World War II. And it was Alger who, in 1948, during the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee, was accused of being a communist and Soviet spy. And although Alger maintained his innocence, he was eventually convicted of perjury. The highly visible and publicly debated case helped fuel the post-war Red Scare in the United States that culminated in the now infamous hearings instigated by Senator Joseph McCarthy. And in a world where we know we can be very polarized, history repeats itself, right? So this was a moment that was also of great polarization in the United States. And in interviewing Muffi Hiss, I know she said, and I'm paraphrasing Muffi, but it was not easy to have the last name Hiss in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And I also want to begin to talk a little bit about perhaps the influence both of school design, but particularly the architectural influence on Philip Hanson Hiss. What you're seeing here on the screen is the Crow Island School in Winnetka, Illinois. It's now a National Historic Landmark. It has been recognized as perhaps the leading model for school design of the post-World War II era. It was done just prior to World War II. It was by the father and son architectural team of Aero and Alil Saarinen with Perkins, Wheeler, and Wheel. Perkins and Wheel, which is still a leading architectural firm today, would become perhaps among the leading school designers. But it was really this school that set them in that direction. As noted in the video, this was a return or an alternative proposal to the two-story neoclassical. If you think about the original 1920 Sarasota High School building, this was an alternative paradigm that was being offered. It looks more like a single-family house, right, with the chimney. The plan was what was called a finger plan, with the different wings. Each classroom had an exterior classroom that was directly adjacent and could be accessed from inside. The spaces themselves the classrooms were divided into activity areas, very much reflecting the educational theories and pedagogy of John Dewey. There was a messy area you can see over there towards the left with sinks and what have you. And I'm actually wanted to propose an idea with my talk that maybe we can discuss later during the Q&A, but the whole idea about American modernism or modern architecture and its sort of strong political and social agenda. As modernism was born between the world wars in Europe, it was meant to transform society, to rebuild Western democracy in Europe. And in part, that was translated to the United States. And to quote Sarah Williams Goldhagen, from its inception, the modern movement has been premised upon the notion that architectural culture must grapple with the society of its time. Since society itself is always evolving, the movement from the start invited critique, reassessment, and revision from within. So what I want you to take away is that while we admire very much the aesthetics and we love the design of the modern architecture, it's the process of arriving at, collectively, those values that are embedded in that architecture that I think really were the things that motivated Hiss. I also want to remind you that he split his time between Brooklyn, New York, and New Canaan, Connecticut. Among Sarasota, Palm Springs, Los Angeles, Miami, New Canaan is one of those hotbeds of modernism. Just before, but certainly after World War II, a concentration of modernist houses that is rivaled by very few cities, Sarasota being one of them. And as about the moment that he embarked on his voyage that brought him to Sarasota, you have the construction of houses like Marcel Breuer's Breuer House 1 in 1948. Now, I don't have a smoking gun in the archives that said he visited it or how acknowledgeable he was of it. But given the fact that he paid a lot of attention to the people and the things around him, I'm going to assume that this experience in New Canaan was certainly an influence as well. So in 1948, at the age of 38, Hiss relocated to Sarasota. A relatively unspoiled subtropical paradise, Sarasota had long attracted an eclectic mix of seasonal and year-round residents. By the late 1940s, a community of artists and intellectuals began to gather. Hiss found his home among these artistic types and their admirers, the intelligentsia of post-war Sarasota. In 1952, Hiss ran and was elected to the Sarasota County Board of Public Instruction and served for 8 years, 4 years as chairman. Upon being elected chair of the board in 1956, Hiss appointed Dr. John I Goodlad of the University of Chicago to work with a team of educational specialists to undertake a comprehensive study of the public school. John I Goodlad and the University the University of Chicago and their educational lab there was very much in the keeping of John Dewey and his educational theories and pedagogy. What resulted from the study was a 324-page report that identified the challenges facing Sarasota and provided recommendations ranging from appointing, rather than publicly electing, the school superintendent, to raising teacher salaries, to improving arts education. To quote Hiss, "If we were teaching the same old things the same old way, we would be standing still while the rest of the world moved ahead. Though change for the sake of change is not the path to progress, without change, there can be no progress. So, there is the myth, the man, the myth, the legend, and the reality. So, it was very controversial when Hiss stepped into the school board. I think some of the quotes from the paper said he was pounding the table. There was a large, prolonged debate over purchasing a recorder so that he could record his fellow board members, particularly the chair, which I don't think he held in very high regard. They spent a lot of time on this tape recorder. But what I do love, and even if it is a bit of a myth, but it was a very dramatically played out in a couple of newspaper articles where Hiss stood up. It was a Time magazine article about new approaches to school building. He apparently threw the article on the table and pointed to a number of the school designs. The school design that was highlighted in that Time magazine article was Heathcote Elementary School in Scarsdale, New York, which I happen to have done some research on. Perkins and Will, again, with the Crow Island School in Winnetka, Illinois, who'd become a leader in school design, had designed this building that was then under construction. It was also a campus design with these long glass enclosed because of the environment in Westchester County, New York, where it was located. These long and glass corridors that reached out to these little villages or pods of classrooms. That's a view you can see from the time that it opened in 1953 of one of those glass enclosed corridors. And you can see the amount of transparency and both the visual and physical connection from interior to exterior. Again, I think this was the type of architecture that Hiss was promoting for Sarasota. And while Lorrie Muldowney is going to be talking more about the Sarasota Public School program, something that I've focused a lot of my research on, I just want to highlight two particular cases. We all know Paul Rudolph and Riverview High School, as well as Paul Rudolph's addition to the Sarasota High School. But I want to come back to Goodlad, who was hired to do this study. Goodlad, again, who was very much in keeping with the thinking, the theories, the pedagogy of John Dewey, was promoting, and he became, by the way, an amazing educational theorist in his own right, sort of almost rivaling that of John Dewey, his early mentor. One of the things that he promoted as a young educational theorist was the idea of this non-graded curriculum. And it was with Englewood Elementary, the south part of Sarasota County, where Jack West and John Goodlad were brought together by Philpis Hiss to create a new approach to elementary school learning. Constructed in 1959, Englewood Elementary embodied the idea of form follows pedagogy to create an unconventional environment focused on individual learning. The master plan and first phase classroom wing, which you see in this aerial photograph, were designed to accommodate a gradeless curriculum with teams of teachers that allowed each pupil to matriculate at their own pace. To facilitate team teaching and individual learning, so-called, quote, nests of 9 classrooms utilized this amazing new technology, the accordion wall. It's the beginning. It's a very early example of the open classroom, which I think probably was a uniform disaster. But anyway, at that point, they were all about trying this new technology. So it would allow the expansion from a 750 square foot classroom to 1,000 to 2,000. All of the furniture, which you see, could be rolled. It was all on casters, could be rolled outside because there were big window walls that opened up. It could be put in a closet. So it was meant to give complete, if you think about Philpis Hiss's beating the drum of individual freedom, the idea of giving all of this freedom to the teachers and to the pupils, I think really this school embodies those ideas. Goodlad acknowledged the role of the principals and teachers who, and this is his quote, worked closely with the architect in seeking to ensure flexible use space to connect with a flexible concept of pupil placement and upward progression, end quote. And I would argue, I know how much we love Rudolph. I know how important the Riverview was. I, like many, worked to try to save that building. But I would argue that Englewood was perhaps one of the most successful of the Hiss experiments with school design to marry innovative modernist architecture and innovative pedagogy. By the way, I had a chance to interview Goodlad before he passed away in my early days of doing research here in Sarasota, and I asked him why it didn't succeed, and his answer was pretty simple. They actually recruited some of the best young teachers from across the country to come to Englewood, Florida to teach. They happened to be young women. He said, "Have you spent the night in Englewood?" He said they weren't married, there wasn't a lot to do. He said it really had nothing to do with the education, it had to do with the social life, but I'm sorry if you're from Englewood. Just some other photographs. You can see this beautiful, vibrant blue color, too, of that exposed structure. These are photographs provided by Jack West when we did the interview. I should also note that Hiss and Goodlad remained friends and close throughout, I think, the majority of their life. They even had a proposal for a book project, The American Public School, once Goodlad had relocated to the University of California. It was never completely realized, but there was clearly a very strong kind of endearment between those two gentlemen. So the other thing I want to talk about is segregation, and to go back to Seth Lowe and his work with the Tuskegee Institute and the idea of racial equality and the equality of all human beings. Despite Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and the Supreme Court ruling in 1954, the Sarasota public school system was racially segregated into the 1960s. Although he did not publicly challenge the separate but equal facilities for Sarasota's public school children, Hiss, in a newspaper report on the Sarasota County Executive Committee, it was clear that he had very strong views against segregation. And one of the executive committee members, Forrest Freeman, again, this is 1954, who was a member of the county committee and a state committeeman, proposed legislation which would prohibit integrating a school without a vote of parents of children attending the particular school. And such action would prohibit parents from finding out suddenly that the school board decided to integrate the school. This is according to Freeman. And he told the committee, as it was reported in a newspaper article, that recently school board chairman Philpis Hiss said segregation is, and this is his quote, morally wrong. He comments that Hiss dominates the board fully, I think we can all attest to that, and questioned whether the people could trust him to carry out the wish of the majority in such a matter. And Freeman said he respected Hiss's honesty in stating his stance. And I will say the separate but equal, I think Philpis Hiss did ensure that the schools that were designed for the Newtown portion of neighborhood of Sarasota was, in fact, just as well designed, as well funded as any of the schools that were part of the Sarasota public school program. Booker Elementary, 1957, was by father and son architects Ralph and William Zimmerman, who had worked with Hiss on Lido Shores. They used the cluster type plan alluded to in the video with these 4 villages. You can see these courtyards, right? The villages are centered around these courtyards. Each of the courtyards contains these large-scale diamond-shaped pavers and speaker podiums with reflecting pools. And my architectural historian reading of this, I like to think, was that these podiums were meant to give voice to a people who maybe didn't have a voice at that time. We were on the burgeoning or the beginning of the civil rights movement in the United States. And so I think the architecture sort of reflected and supported that civil rights effort. The classroom interiors were connected through a series of doorless openings. All of the classrooms contained their own restrooms and long counters with sinks for messy activities. Each of the classrooms also had a corresponding enclosed and partially covered outdoor learning space, and that's a view of the interior of the classrooms, very well appointed. So in the end, because I am a preservationist, after all, I want to conclude with a few thoughts on preserving the legacy of Philip Hanson Hiss and the Sarasota School of Architecture. As I've already alluded to, and I think many of you in this room were very involved in the efforts, the advocacy to save Riverview High School, which unfortunately fell short, and it was demolished in June of 2009 on a Saturday. The they didn't even empty the school as they began to demolish it. It had furniture and other things inside. It was a prolonged battle. I want to, again, the things you may walk away with today. There's a reason I left, by the way, the University of Florida, the director of historic preservation. They ran me out. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not the best preservationist, perhaps. Not the most traditional. Preservation is what my grandmother did in Kentucky with vegetables. She preserved things. I mean, it makes it sound like you're freezing things in time, right? Like, that is not what preservation is. Preservation is about managing change and managing it sensitively and engaging and understanding the values of as many of the residents of a community as possible. I think that's what, again, was alluded to in the video, this idea of values. That's what preservation is about. That's what architecture, modernist architecture is about. And so this, unfortunately, was the values, at least in 2009, when I think the economics outweighed the other values here in Sarasota. And one thing I do want to, listen, I'm an aesthetics. I love the modernist architecture, but I think we have to go beyond that, those series of values, and what that aesthetic actually embodies. I've just talked about, we learned through the video, we're learning more about all the other values that were associated with the schools and Lido Shores and the other projects of Philpis Hiss. Again, architecture is not just a product, but a process. It does bring us together as a community. It helps us identify those collective values. It's sometimes messy, again, has been alluded to. But I think it's important that we move beyond just the aesthetics. My very first graduate student, 2010, at the University of Florida, we looked at almost 180 articles that were written about the fight to save Riverview. They were, without exception, all about the importance of Paul Rudolph as an architect, as the importance of the architecture of Riverview. It in no way engaged other values that included the fact that many people had their senior prom in the courtyard, right? That there were these personal values, these personal experiences associated with Riverview. And I think that if we are to begin to preserve these buildings, we're going to have to move beyond the aesthetics and look for and really embrace all of those values. And if nothing else, this little boy from Kentucky, a holler, 12 years old, coming and experiencing Sarasota, it changed my life. So I hope that Sarasota will continue to change other people's lives. Thank you. And again, thank you to the Hiss family. I love this. This is by Burt Brosmith, their Christmas card. The addition that was done, all of those different skylights. Santa's like, what the hell's going on here? How do I get inside? Thank you all so much. I look forward to the rest of the symposium.
Marty, thank you so much. And Lorrie, do you want to come on up? Christopher, are you next? Oh, I thought we were going schools and then Lido. Great. Christopher Wilson, come on up. Marty, thank you. That was amazing. And yes, it's important. We've all worked hard to save works of art and architecture, but it's about what happens in the architecture and the impact that art has on us as human beings. That's really what's important. Christopher Wilson, familiar to most of you, great architectural historian, and we'll have you take it away so we can keep moving on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marty. That was really excellent. I would like to add one thing. It's Weston Waters, right? Not just Jack West, also Elizabeth Boylston Waters, who was the first female architect registered here in the, at the time it was the Central Florida chapter. So that's all I'm gonna say about that. That's right, that's right. And you can check out my, my book chapter. Well, I won't plug that, but I've written about the women in Sarasota School. But today I'm here to talk about Lido Shores. And those of you who don't know me, I teach architecture and design history at Ringling College, but I'm also now with the new organization, officially the Scholar in Residence. So this is Lido Shores, just to orient everyone. North of St. Armand's Circle on, and south of Longboat Key, right there. little bit close up, right on, that is New Pass right there. And the story of Lido Shores is that in the 1930s, the city of Sarasota had this idea to make actually, go back two, sorry. No, go back one. They had an idea to make a deep water port right there where it says Municipal Auditorium on the mainland, and they dredged New Pass and then put all the sand onto Lido Shores. And I mean, there was something there anyway, but that is how Lido Shores was created. This is what it looked like in 1948. The only thing that's there is the road connecting St. Armand's Circle and Longboat Key, that road right there, which was unpaved at the time. It was just a track. And here's something interesting. This is an overlay of that aerial view that I was showing you with the current property lines. So you can see the road. The road is still there, and you can also see that the neighbors to the west have a little bit more land than, than they used to. So, as has already been said, Philpis Hiss came to Sarasota in 1948. He's definitely here by December 48. He's described in a Fort Myers newspaper as being from Sarasota. He married Miss Shirley Holt. Is Shirley here this morning? No. He married Shirley on 14th of September, 1949, and he constructed the first house on Lido Shores by the end of that year. And this is from, in the video, there was an article from 1954, House and Home magazine, and between 49 and 54, there are 19 houses that are built. I misspelled that, sorry about that. As I've already said, by December 1949, he built his first house on Lido Shores for himself and Shirley at 1255 Westway, and they called it Bali High. It's supposed to be H-A-I. It was designed by the father and son duo of Ralph and William Zimmerman, as we've already heard. And it was published here in 1951, Woman's Home Companion, Recipe for Year-Round Living. The Zimmermans were originally from Chicago, and although this house is quite modern in terms of its open floor plan, let's zoom in a little, in terms of its open floor plan and the amount of glass that it has, I just think the Zimmermans couldn't bring themselves to do the ultimate modern form, which is the flat roof. So they have this kind of pagoda roof. Is Carl here? Carl's here, right? It says, "This house belongs to the land." This house belongs to the land, which is is Carl here? Which is an expression that Carl also uses. Yeah, he's raising his hand over there. Regardless of what that actually means, it's certainly, the house was certainly different from what actually was being built in the rest of Sarasota at the time, which was Mediterranean revival houses, Spanish style, whatever you want to call it, damp and dark, small little windows. Which is something that Ralph Twitchell at this time was writing about, how those, even though he did design structures like that, those types of structures were not appropriate to Florida living. It wasn't the correct thing to do. And there they are, enjoying their house. They find their sunny courtyard a pleasant spot on warm days and cool ones. And you see how it's, except for the roof, everything is there in terms of inside, outside living. The floor paving goes right in. There's no kind of distinction between the outside, right on the on New Pass there. So he purchases that whole property from the Ringling Estates and lays out the roads, and he begins to develop it. At first, with these really kind of cartoonish advertisements. I don't know who drew them. I suspect maybe it was Philpis Hiss. I don't know, I need to get some confirmation about that. But from the very beginning, he's not an architect, but from the very beginning, he's making the point that you should use an expert, right? You should have someone who, from the real technical things like blueprints and specifications. That's how he's billing himself. Philpis Hiss Associates. Now, this is something I came across that was very interesting. You know, we don't do this anymore, but in the old newspapers, they used to have this, you know, who's doing what, right? And here's it. Mr. and Mrs. William Zimmerman and Philpis Hiss were in Lakeland for the dedication ceremonies of Florida Southern College, where Frank Lloyd Wright delivered an address. And the reason why I bring this up is because Florida Southern College seems to be this pivotal thing in the Sarasota School of Architecture. We know that Paul Rudolph took Ralph Twitchell there in 1941, and you know, Frank Lloyd Wright, it's Frank Lloyd Wright. Everyone knows that that's, you know, at the time the embodiment of modern architecture. So what happens is, after this date, after 1950, Phillips Hiss's aesthetics kind of change from the previous, you know, perhaps inspired by Bali, the previous architecture, to definitely more of a high modernist style. So first house, Bali High. And then what he basically did was he would build houses and live in them and then sell them. That's what he did. So he sold Bali High. It's referred to in the 1954 article as the Williams House, because I guess a couple called the Williams purchased it. And then at 1313 Westway, he builds this. And like I said, it's just like this big shift in aesthetics. John Howie, the author of Sarasota School of Architecture, has called this structure the first two-story concrete house on Sarasota Bay. It's actually on New Pass, as I showed you. L-shaped structure with a carport directly on Westway. The L was organized around a pool area, and that one wing is up on stilts. And this, if this looks familiar to you, that's because it's also, well, similar shot that was used in Holiday Magazine, 1954, which was, it was a whole article about Sarasota and the circus and all these things, and this is one of the shots there. And speaking of the values of modern architecture, there's another layer here in which it's the Florida lifestyle, right? This is what you can do if you live in Florida. You can sit around the pool, and you can have your servant make cocktails for you. Yes, the pool actually went under that wing. You see that column right there? It actually goes right down into the pool. And then inside, I'm going quickly because I have too many slides. Inside, a spiral staircase, which will become, you'll see, it'll become his, he designed this, sorry, I didn't say, Philpis Hiss designed this, and the spiral staircase became his kind of signature piece in all the houses. So although Ralph Twitchell and Paul Rudolph had been designing and building modern houses in the area since the late 1940s, this was much larger and more dramatic than anything that they had done, and it was, as you can see covered here, exciting contemporary home done on Lido Shores. So he continues to advertise Lido Shores. People come and they buy properties, and then they build a house there. Again, 1951 version of his cartoonish advertisements. And then he realizes 1952, it gets built in 1953, that he should have an office there. And so that's what the Hiss Studio is. I particularly don't like the name Hiss Studio, but whatever, I'm going to go with it. It was the development office for Hiss Associates. And there it is. We've already seen that very much kind of staged photograph with the white wall tires and the white columns. It's generally credited to Tim Siebert, and I'm not going to take anything away from Tim Siebert. He certainly he did the drawings, and he's the architect of record. But I have there Phillips Hiss ? Because I would think that Phillips Hiss had a lot to do with, you know, this is how I want it. I want this modern structure to be my office. So far, this is the only thing that I've shown which is still around. Those other houses have been demolished. And if you came to the mod opening party last night, this is where we had our party. And this, I thought I was going to be the first one to show this, but now this is like the third time you've seen it. This is from Phillips Hiss's Bali book, kind of learning from this indigenous architecture. Now, in this case, it's to lift the structure up off the ground, keep the rice dry. But the Hiss studio is actually air conditioned from the first, from the very first day. So this was published here in 1959. Home designer Philpis Hiss, he was not an architect, he conceived this unusual structure for a studio or a home. And as we know, this is the John Ringling side, which used to have these aluminum louvers, and the image that Marty showed with the various skylights, that hasn't been built yet. That will be built in 1962. So, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Go back. So as a potential buyer, you would arrive at the house. The block part was actually smaller than it is now. That was widened when they built the rear addition. But you would enter through the doors, and you would come across a spiral staircase. And if that looks familiar, because that is the one that we've been seeing all along here, that Philpis chose for his headshot. You would go upstairs and you would conduct your business. You would choose a lot. This is what it looks like today, but it's very much the way that it was. You choose a lot, make a down payment, etc. Philpis might even do a little napkin sketch for you. We'll see in a second that he has, there are houses that are credited to him at Lido Shores. The shelves, the bookshelves, which are original, contained Hiss's extensive collection of books, which is some of the reason for the air conditioning. So if you haven't been, you might go today. It's open today, the Hiss studio. Come up the stairs. There's also an office and a bathroom there to the left, and a small little kitchenette. So, so he's living at 1313. His office is at 1310, and Philpis Hiss decides to design to commission a show house, and this is the umbrella house that we know today. There it is in 1950s. Nothing else around. Well, the Hiss studio is next door. This is in the 1960s, before Hurricane Alma knocked down the umbrella. And it's billed as Florida's most unusual home. So 2,500 people in one afternoon made it impossible for many of you to thoroughly inspect Florida's most unusual home. So they had an open house, not only for prospective buyers, but for anyone, anyone who's interested in new architecture and new ideas. And I came across this very interesting. It's called the Summer Slat House on floridamemory.com. So we believe that the first, it was a show house, but then it was sold to someone. So it's going to be, I'm trying to find out their first names. Mr. and Mrs. Summers were the first occupants of the house. It's the inside. It's also open for tour today. Very compact, 1,800 square feet, 3-bed, 3-bath house. Organized around the double living room. We've already seen this. This was the only color image in that article. So the umbrella house gets full billing. And this is what it looks like today, thanks in large part to the stewards of the umbrella house today, Bob and Ann Essner, who have, well, they finished the previous owner's project of restoring the umbrella back to its original state. One final residence, one final Hiss residence. So he builds Bali High, sells it. I don't know who he sold that one to, but then it's just barely off the map there, 1415 Westway. As explained in this article in House and Garden in 1957, the family, Hiss had children from a previous marriage, Valerie and Michael, and then there was also Philip IV, Muffi, and Maynard. And it says there, this sheltered court and pool in Miami, Florida. I mean, come on, check your sources, people. It's something that, we talk about, Sarasota was, great modern architecture, but it really was kind of not that known. I've seen lots of things about Philpis Hiss building on Longboat Key and building in Miami and all this stuff. So yes, he did make us famous, but I think the people up in New York, they think Florida, it's Miami, right? Anyway, again, it was on New Pass. Again, it was organized around a pool, public areas on the ground floor, the living, dining, kitchen with a carport, and then upstairs, the private areas, master and the children's rooms. It was much more monolithic appearance, blocky, than the other one, which was a little bit more dramatic, but just as modern. And I thought I was going to be the one to embarrass Muffi, but this was already shown. That's Muffi hanging upside down there, with another dramatic stair designed by Phillips Hiss. So other Hiss design houses on Lido Shores here. This is from that 1954 article, and you see the switch between much more traditional architecture to this modern architecture. And this one here, the Severs house, Claude Severs was the sales manager for Lido Shores, and so he got a house designed by Phillips Hiss, and getting much more professional here, as you can see, no cartoonish advertisements. Lido Shores being billed as Florida's exclusive colony of fine homes. So none of those other houses are around anymore, but these are still here. And you can see them, I don't know which ones are open, but you can see them from the outside here on the Lido Shores walking tour today. This one is not around anymore. It was next to Bali High. It's the Choate residence. I have no idea if it's related to the school, but that is the name of it, with this huge, it's a screened-in porch, basically. They're doing this in Florida. Now, for the most important part, this is why I'm here to tell you. And in conclusion, so if you bought a property from Phillips Hiss, Lido Shores, in the deed of your Lido Shores property, there were some very interesting stipulations. Number one, well, B, all structures erected on the above described property shall be of the tropical modern architectural design and aesthetically complementary to the existing residential structures. So he was, forcing you to do that. You could not build the Mediterranean revival. And then all structures had to be at least 1,200 square feet. So he was going for a certain size. And all structures had to be the plans and specifications prepared and certified by an architect duly registered and licensed to practice in the state of Florida, which is interesting because he was not an architect himself, but he was asking for this, and this is in your deed, and you had to do it. Now, I don't know the way. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the way it works, but this is not the case now. These early structures were sold. And I guess that deed restriction didn't continue because as you go around Lido Shores, there are some tropical modern architecture examples. So maybe we can work on that, hopefully. I'm not finished yet. Two more things really quick, because just Phillips Hiss is just absolutely amazing. I came across this. He was involved with this development. It's on Bee Ridge Road, just past I-75, which wasn't there at the time. And it says Phillips Hiss, homes by Phillips Hiss. And there's a little sketch there, and the home of tomorrow. And I went out there, I couldn't find it. If it was built, I don't know if it's been demolished since. So, he had a name for himself here, 1956, nationally famous creator of custom homes. And I also found this on Longboat Key. He designed a house called the Green Hill Residence on Longboat Key. And I want to leave you with this image, very nice image of Phillips Hiss and the Green Hills sketching out the plan of the house on the sand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher, Architecture Sarasota's scholar in residence. And I'd like to introduce Laura Muldowney, who you all probably know, who has worked tirelessly forever in a variety of guises to preserve the architecture here in Sarasota. Thank you so much, Lorrie.
Thank you. Well, good morning. It's so nice to be here. I am in the enviable position of getting to talk about the schools that Philpis Hiss was involved with here in a little bit more detail. Based on the earlier presentations, you can tell that his interest in education and his interest in the schools and architecture of the schools certainly ran through his work. But I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. We will, actually, this slide isn't yet. If we can start with just the statement slide. Okay. So let's see. So it's my belief that Philpis Hiss's influence on education was probably his most significant and broad-reaching public contribution in a long life where there were many. It was a contribution, as we've heard, to both Sarasota and the larger educational community, really all over the country. And it endures today. It lasts in the buildings that remain from the period. Some of you will be on trolley tours this weekend viewing them. And also in the educational philosophy and innovations that he championed, as we've heard about earlier from Marty Hylton. With his contributions, Mr. Hiss touched the lives of 5,600 students, which at the time in the 1950s were about half of the school-aged population of the county. Before he was done, all of those students were attending class in new schools in Sarasota County. His leadership on the board resulted in the construction of 9 schools that cost $7 million. In today's dollars, that's about $66 million. So it was really changes that kind of rocked our community. As we've heard a little bit about, the public school program was completed in just 5 years between about 1954 and 1960. And his efforts drew attention to Sarasota from across the country, and perhaps just as importantly, launched the careers of a majority of the members of the Sarasota School of Architecture. Previous to their work on the public schools, they were mostly working on small residential projects. In an interview by Sarasota Herald Tribune journalist Alan Horton, which was conducted in the 1980s, Paul Rudolph was quoted as saying, "Philpis Hiss at last came through with the school. I was afraid I'd spend the rest of my life on guest houses and tasty freezes." He did a tasty freeze here. Well, that wasn't the case at all for Paul Rudolph, but that's really a topic for another presentation. Not to be overlooked is the involvement of Mr. Hiss in the creation of New College. I'm so thankful for this beautiful setting here today. In 1960, as the chair of the Board of Trustees of New College was created as a private liberal arts college. As we've heard about, in 1963, 9 nationally recognized architects were invited to participate in a competition to develop a campus design, and architect I.M. Pei was selected unanimously. Hiss's actions also helped to create an environment here in Sarasota where enlightened civic and ecclesiastical architecture was possible. In fact, it was expected. Part of this public legacy includes buildings such as Jack West's Sarasota City Hall and his Nokomis Beach Pavilion, great public sites for you to enjoy if you haven't seen them. Of course, Victor Lundy's Chamber of Commerce building, we know today as the Blue Tile Pagoda, and St. Paul's Lutheran Church, and not to be forgotten is Tim Siebert's Siesta Key Beach Pavilion. So stepping back in time, let's quickly take a look at Sarasota over 100 years ago. And I would say to you, hold on, because it's quite a ride. Now, this slide is of the Central School, which was the first publicly funded school in Sarasota County. It was built in 1904, and it was located where today's post office is on Ringling Boulevard between Orange and Osprey Avenue. There were other early schools. A notable one which still exists was built in 1914 in the rural community of Myakka, wonderful one-room schoolhouse that serves today as a community center there. By the 1920s, public schools were located along the Tamiami Trail from as far north as today's Bay Haven School of Basics Plus in the northern limits of the city to as far south as Englewood in southern Sarasota County. These were built during the Sarasota land boom of the 1920s, which was a period of great growth that occurred, of course, prior to the Great Depression and World War II. We should keep in mind, as has been mentioned, that of course schools were segregated here until the mid-1960s. Okay, great. So this is a school that's typical of the schools that were being built here in the 30s and 40s. This is the Rosenwald School. Maybe some of you have heard about this great man. Julius Rosenwald was the president of Sears. And he promoted a program of building schools for members of the African American community because in so many instances, formal education was not available, and of course the schools themselves were rather deplorable. So by 1928, half of all African American school children in the rural South attended a school that was supported by Rosenwald's philanthropy. One was located in downtown Sarasota, and ultimately it was moved to the Booker campus when that campus was established. So these were, of course, very simple wood frame schools, but they made a great difference in education in the 1920s. Of course, our story really begins in Sarasota after World War II, when Sarasota was growing in a previously unprecedented fashion. Subdivisions were being developed to meet the need for housing. The first large ones were Paver Park, Kensington Park, and as we see here, the Southgate community. Plans for Southgate were announced in 1955. The subdivision was the largest in the history of the community, located on 1,200 acres of land that had previously been occupied by orange groves. A sales brochure used the tagline, "Southgate, where you live among the orange blossoms." It was unique because it was an all-inclusive community complete with a shopping center, post office, clubhouse, and yes, a school. And that's where our story begins. I would like to mention, though, that because of the attention that the public schools drew, their architects, including Victor Lundy, Jack West, and the Zimmermans, were afforded opportunities to design model and speculative homes. This is a photograph of the Southgate Community Center, which was done by Victor Lundy and still exists today. So the architects were given opportunities, and their profile in the community was growing with these opportunities. Let's see now. So at around the same time as Southgate was being developed, Mr. Hiss was elected to the Sarasota County Board of Public Instruction. Rather somber photograph here, Mr. Hiss in the center. He was the first Republican to serve on the Sarasota County Board of Public Instruction since Reconstruction days. As we've heard about, he influenced, then directed Sarasota County Schools building program for the following 8 years until about 1961. When recalling his decision to run for the school board, he stated in Time magazine that, "When I got the facts, I went wild. Some of the schools were downright unsanitary. The restrooms were so bad the kids wouldn't even go inside, and the curriculum was equally bad." So as I said, towards the end of his term, Hiss was garnering attention across the country for the Sarasota County schools. You've heard about previously that he was published extensively. Architectural Forum in 1959, Architectural Record in the same year, that was providing attention to the school board and stating For instance, the Determined and Imaginative School Board of Sarasota County, Florida, has commissioned the most exciting and varied group of new schools in the United States. And Florida Architect, same year, the school board that dared. It can happen here. The program of Sarasota County is a case study of progress worth emulation by every school board in the state. So Little Sarasota was getting a lot of attention in the national press in the 1950s. Mr. Hiss himself expressed his beliefs by stating that there was a lot of room for growth. We still express lip service to the democratic ideal of individualism, yet the trend towards mass conformity becomes greater every day. Why should each school be the same? Because schools are not built in a vacuum, but play a part in an existing social structure and act on it as well as being acted upon. Because each community has the right, indeed the responsibility, to do what is best for its own children and to maintain its own individuality. These are some very strong words that really serve to guide the public school system building program for the years to come. Okay, so let's talk in a little bit of detail about the schools. As I mentioned earlier, there's a trolley tour and you'll see some of the schools. Unfortunately, many of them have been replaced over the years. Brookside is the first one I want to talk about. I'm going to go through these quickly, but there are a few that I wanted to focus on. So there is a Brookside school today. It replaced the Brookside school that was done by Ralph and William Zimmerman, and I want to say that it was replaced in the mid-1990s. I feel like this school was of particular importance to the movement because it was the first school, and it was a fight, as we've heard earlier, by Mr. Hiss to get this change in the design of schools and to change things that had been done the same way for so long. It was deemed a success in no small part because it came in below budget and before its scheduled date of completion, things that anybody who has built a home or worked on a construction project knows are pretty important. But in this context, it was very important because it did set the stage for success. As you can see here, when we look back at the photograph of the Central School, it was a complete departure from the design of schools that had pre-existed it. Those schools, like Central, were based upon a traditional corridor design typified by a single square or rectangular building with an interior corridor. At Brookside, there was a central courtyard plan which encouraged learning through more positive and personal interactions, moving the educational focus away from the institution and towards the individual. We've talked a little bit about the plans. Marty showed some wonderful photographs of the modern schools that were done prior to Brookside, and makes my job easy because you can see the similarities here. Brookside used what by that time was being called a cluster plan with small groupings of buildings. There were 18 regular classrooms organized in a linear fashion in 3 long rectangular buildings. Shortly after Brookside was completed, and this is a school you'll see on the tour later, Victor Lundy completed an addition to Alta Vista Elementary School, which still exists today, although in a form that looks slightly different. It was called the Butterfly Wing. This is a beautiful, beautiful photograph. The roof structure, of course, defines the design with its appearance of soaring wings. These wings create a shaded area for outdoor classrooms on both sides of the double-loaded corridor and were designed to be freestanding. The only physical attachment between the wall and the roof was a fixed glass. After Alta Vista, in rapid succession, came a number of new schools, including Venice Junior High by Mark Hampton. This wonderful photograph shows the reflecting pools and large circular planting areas. In the rear, you can see the multicolored tiles which were added for visual interest. Englewood Elementary, an image you've already seen by West and Waters, whose design was tailored to suit an innovative educational program which grouped students by ability rather than age, and those flexible classroom spaces. So, as you can see, the school stood in stark contrast to earlier classrooms. This is an interior photograph of a typical Rosenwald school. Again, that would have been from the 20s and 30s, with limited natural light and ventilation. As I looked at this photograph, I realized it looks like it has more light than it actually does because there's no roof structure on it. So just imagine, this experience of moving from a classroom that looked more like this to what we saw in Englewood. Booker Elementary School, again, flooded by natural light, clearer story windows, and skylights created a much brighter interior. And at Fruitville, this is a photograph, this is a drawing from the Jack West collection, sliding glass doors which opened to a corridor that received natural light and air. Brentwood Elementary School, which still exists today, a little bit east of town, employed outdoor classroom spaces, as did most of the other schools. These were natural extensions of the indoor space, utilizing a time-honored principle of the Sarasota School of Architecture to invite the outdoors in and blur that transition between them. To many, the crowning achievement of Sarasota County's public school building program, of course, was Riverview High. It was designed by Paul Rudolph and completed in 1957. The school was a two-story glass pavilion nestled along Philippi Creek and the native pine trees. A system of concrete clouds shaded the classrooms from direct sunlight, and the two-story design allowed air to flow upwards and escape through roof openings. I went to school there. The school drew attention from the architectural press and Florida's governor at the time of its opening. So really the last school of the public school system that I recognize, there is some conversation, and there were more schools that were well done afterwards. But Sarasota High School kind of signaled the end of that magical period of time, at least based on my research. It was completed in 1960, also by Paul Rudolph, and it kind of signaled the end of the glory days. For in my opinion, a couple of different reasons. It was a school that was more expensive. It actually was significantly more expensive than some of the earlier schools. And I think that when we look at the construction, we can understand that. But it didn't really meet with the public acclaim that the earlier schools had. Folks felt that it was cold and it was not as welcoming as the earlier campuses. And I think when you compare Riverview to Sarasota High, you can see those differences. It is an amazing structure, and I'm very thankful that we still have it today. This photograph captures the essence of it with the floating cubes and the monumental stairway. So an important postscript to Hiss's school building program was, of course, his involvement in the creation of New College of Florida. As we've heard a little bit about, there was an international competition, and I.M. Pei was selected to be the architect here. It was identified, Pei did the dorms, and in 2012, these were identified as one of Florida's top 100 buildings, and as importantly, in a 2018 survey of Florida's mid-century modern architecture completed by the University of Florida's program, the Pei residence halls were selected as one of only 7 educational properties in the state to be included among the flagship structures, and they recommended it for landmark historic designation. So I would say that this is a building that we need to pay some attention to. These are some great pre-construction photographs that I was able to find of it, and we've seen it in its final form, and it's right across the street. So, towards conclusion, whatever happened to Sarasota? This was the title of an article published in 1967, and as I've touched on, a number of factors contributed to the end of this exciting time. First, Mr. Hiss departed as the chairman of the Board of Public Instruction, and as I mentioned, there was some public criticism of the high cost and lack of emotional warmth of Rudolph's addition to Sarasota High School. Later, the addition of air conditioning to so many of these schools also compromised their design integrity. Within 4 or 5 years of the completion of Sarasota High, the school board made a decision to begin air conditioning the public schools. And that really impacted these schools because they had been designed to allow in natural light and promote airflow. Let's see what I've got here. This is a school that was completed just shortly after after Sarasota High School, McIntosh Middle School. And by this time, air conditioning was being incorporated into the design of the schools. However, they were still similar to some of the earlier ones. Unfortunately, today, my nephew would be horrified, this is his school. But many of our schools here have grown very similar in appearance. Of course, there are a lot of changing needs. There's a focus today on campus security and growing technology that have led to campuses that look alike, very different from the modern schools of the mid-century. So in closing, I'd like to say that, as you've heard from Marty, Mr. Hiss was working on a publication that was never finished. I guess you didn't mention this, but I'll mention this. Mr. Hiss was working on a publication that was never finished, but it was all about architecture and education, and the Hiss family was gracious enough to share this working document with Marty and I when we were doing some research. Its premise was that buildings speak a great deal louder than words. They say many things about a community's attitude towards education, intellectualism, and creativity. They speak of interest or apathy, pride or neglect. And I just want to thank the Hiss family and Mr. Hiss for the legacy that he has left for us here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lorrie. This is, as you can see, we have extraordinary architectural historians and scholars here in town. And Marty, I know you're in Denver now, but we're claiming you as a Sarasotan. To conclude our program this morning, we're going to be in conversation, Bob, with Muffi Hiss and Carl Abbott, and we are welcoming Shirley Hiss. Hello, hello. We are celebrating Philip Hiss this weekend, but none of us labors alone, and Philip could not have done anything that he did without the extraordinary love and support of his creative collaborators, Shirley, and the wonderful kids, Muffi, Maynard, and Philip. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Bob Morris. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to just tell you a teeny story of kind of why I'm here for this conversation with Muffi and Carl. Last spring, Carl welcomed us to his beautiful orchid garden at his place and brought Muffi and her mom, Shirley, to lunch. And Shirley Hiss has a vivid and brilliant memory and a sense of humor. And she, as I prodded her, journalist that I am, always looking for humorous anecdotes, she started to tell me about the time when she was in Sarasota and lived next to Paul Rudolph, who was renting, right? next door in Siesta Key. And they became friends. And he exposed her, she told me, to all kinds of things she had never seen before. And then the other thing that Shirley told me was that at some point she laid her eyes upon Philip Hiss, who was 15 years older than she was. She told her parents she met this older man who told her to be careful. And then she decided that she wanted to see more of him. And he was playing the role of the Baron in the community theater. And so she took on the volunteer role as property mistress. And the rest is history, including Muffi here and the other siblings who are visiting. So I say that because as much as we've heard about the technical aspects of architecture, and also I think the idealism behind it, now we have a couple of people. And so what is the life that this architecture gives? So it's kind of a little bit of a rambling Q&A that we're going to have with Carl and Muffi, who are very good friends and had some great adventures together. But, you know, what Philip Hiss said, which is the degree to which people are adjusted to their environment is the true measure of their happiness, is kind of the overriding conversation that I'm going to try to pull out of these two today. So, Carl, you said, you told me that when you first saw Philip Hiss, he was getting out of a gull wing car in a dark suit. What did you think?
Is there a speaker? Yeah. This was in '59. I just finished the University of Florida, and I was working for Bert Brosmith, who was ending the Paul Rudolph office, a really talented architect, Bert Brosmith. And we worked, you want to talk about, we worked every day. We'd break for dinner at night and come back to work, and we'd work Saturdays. One Saturday, I was there in the office, and I looked out at the street. It was right near where the Opera House is on First Street. And this car, the whole side of the car flew up. I had never seen this before. And out stepped this totally immaculately dressed man. That was Philip Hiss. And it was amazing. It was amazing. And of course, he was wearing a suit.
And of course, he was wearing a suit. So obviously, he had some kind of effect the way he had on Shirley years before, right? So then, in terms of what you saw, and this could be for either of you, did you see Philip Hiss interacting a lot with architects, and were there any moments in particular that stuck out? I know the office was upstairs, and so you probably weren't around that much, but they did come and go.
Separate houses. We were in separate houses. The office was a separate building. The house later was out behind, but in those days, we were down the street.
Many of you know where the big Hiss mansion was, that then was given to New College as the president's mansion. And that's what Muffi's just, it's way down at the point, is where the big house was. And it was shown, but in one of the images this morning. But you did not live in the office.
No.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
the office.
But did you see architects around Philip? I mean, were they like kind of secret?
Yeah. Let me try to say it quickly. I was an outsider to a lot of this, like I was the quiet guy in those days, which Muffi doesn't believe. But it was my early 20s, and I was here for a couple of years, and I met Philip Hiss, and first time in the car, like I said, rising out of this amazing car. And then I saw him several times, not a lot of times, and he was considered, to me and to most architects I knew, the younger architects, as an aristocrat. I mean, this is this man who's done all these things for Sarasota. This was around '59 now. And it was about the time that Philip Hiss was leaving the school board, and he was president of the Florida Arts Council also. So I saw things as an outsider, clearly. That was 2 years here, I was here, and then after that, I went to Yale to get my master's. I worked in Honolulu. I worked in London. Came back here and worked again. So that was 2 years later. And then again, before I started my office in '66, I worked in Pay's office here on this campus, which, of course, with Philip Johnson was involved. Excuse me, Philip Hiss was involved in all of that. So I saw things from a different. I was not deeply involved in it. I was on the edge until the '60s.
I guess you had met Paul Rudolph and described him as being very intense to me, Paul Rudolph itself. And I think, did you meet him as well? Maybe an impression or two.
Well, I was a child when I met Paul Rudolph, and he was, I don't know, my family always thought he was an extraordinary architect, and but I didn't know him really as an adult. I knew the others as I got older.
Yeah, I met Paul Rudolph the first time. Well, let me just go back. Well, University of Florida, probably '57, he did a talk here at the state convention. And in those days, Paul Rudolph had this amazing stuttering problem. He could hardly speak in public. I mean, most people don't know that. And when I went to Yale, 2 to 4 years later, 6 years later, he had no stuttering problem. It was amazing. amazing to overcome that. But so I met him then. I met him once here in Sarasota, which would have been probably about 60, well, before I went to Yale. I met him once. And he was came down to work with Bert Brosmith on the end of one of the Rudolph projects. And I went to dinner with him at the plaza and heard what they were saying. And he was almost like a brother or son it was almost like a father-son relationship between Paul Rudolph and Bert Brosmith to me. But then when I went to Yale, Rudolph was a tyrant. I mean, he's been described as the worst Army sergeant you could possibly get under. He would almost kill people, really. He was intense, to put it mildly.
Did you say that he would leave cocktail parties at 10 o'clock and go back to work?
Well, first of all, I don't think Rudolph would go to cocktail parties unless it had to do with getting a project, because his life was architecture. His whole life was architecture. His father was a minister, as I think most of you know, and architecture was Rudolph's religion. It was his life. And he certainly would work every night. I don't question that. He'd come to Yale, and he'd come in like 1 a.m. to the architecture building and want to see what you were working on. He said, let's have a little informal crit on your project. You weren't required to be there, but it was wanted. You were wanted to be there.
My one memory of Paul Rudolph as an adult is we went to a party at Jean Leedy's house, and when we came in the door, my mother saw him and hadn't seen him in years and walked up, and he always had a crew cut and rubbed his head, and all the men went, ah! They couldn't believe anyone would touch him, and he turned around and he gave her a hug. It was so funny, the room stopped when she did it.
Well, I don't know if either of you can talk a little bit about the atmosphere among these architects in the day that we've been talking about today. I mean, any social interactions other than rubbing Paul Rudolph's head? Anything? No. Okay. Apparently there was a place called the Plaza where a lot of the writers would go, and, what interests me about Sarasota is that it did have, I think because the Ringlings actually were bringing in artists from Europe, long before, that there was a little culture, a little vortex of culture, not just architecture, but art and writing and a cosmopolitanism. But I think we should maybe just turn to the life of Muffi in modernism a little bit, because I think probably some of you are familiar with first of all, that image of her hanging off of that stairwell, for one. And the best quote I got from our visit in the garden was, well, you told the story, didn't you? About somebody saying, the children are going to get hurt, or...
It's people. My father didn't believe in railings and things like that on staircases, and people would say, "Oh my God, the children could get hurt," and he'd always say, "We're insured." But
You called, I said, were you a victim of the architecture, Muffy? And you said, oh no, we were conquerors of this architecture.
no, as children, it was we all hung off the staircase. We all were. I mean, I remember Maynard fell. They had a bridge separating the two sections of the house. One day, Maynard fell at Mom's feet, and Philip breaking his arms and legs, and we were pretty adventurous children.
Very adventurous, but apparently you distinguished yourself in the media in particular. I'd read stories in the Herald Tribune that ended up running in Jacksonville about some of your adventures in the neighborhood, because there really wasn't much to do, according to you. So tell us about that. Swimming and breaking into houses. And
No. We, one of the things we used to do was stand on the Longboat Key Bridge, and the three of us would stand on the railing, and a car would pass about every 3 hours, and when the car would go by, we'd wave, and then we'd go like this and fall off backwards. And the cars would stop, and Dan Bird, who owned the bridge store, they'd run in and say, "Oh my God, 3 children just fell off the bridge." And he'd say, "Oh, don't worry, it's the Hiss kids." Oh, and another story, my brothers and I went and painted the what?
Water tower, yeah.
The water tower at St. Armand's, and we painted the whole thing white, and then we stood and we did Hiss as high as we could reach on the side, and we were driving with my mother to St. Armand's, and she looked up and said, "Oh my God, who would have done that?" And we all, I don't think she ever realized how bad we were.
And didn't she go to pick you up when you were 6 years old after you swam across and gave you a very stern 1, 2, 3 or something like that?
I swam across New Pass, and
6 years old, ladies and gentlemen.
I don't know how, I was 6 or 7. I don't know how old I was, but one of the, Mr. Latner, I think, said to my mother, Muffy's swimming across the pass. And my mother drove across the bridge, and when I got there, she was standing on the edge and said, "I'll give you a count to 3 to get out of the water." And I looked at the water, and I looked at her, and I started swimming back.
So, but your mom was a relatively, she seems an adventurous mom, not like a strict 50s mom. I mean, I don't know, but 60s mom. I mean, did she give you free rein? Did your father give you free rein?
I don't know. I'd have to, I don't know.
Well, tell us about sneaking into houses that you weren't supposed to sneak into in the neighborhood.
Oh, well, we used to, every house that was under construction, we'd sort of take the wood for our underground forts. And Mom actually would climb down into the underground forts to make sure they were safe. So,
Oh, so she did the safety checks, not your father, apparently.
no, I don't think Dad ever would climb into an underground fort. But
Was it fun to have like kind of the run of the neighborhood? I mean, there's not much traffic there. It seems like a kind of a
no,
paradise,
there was
really.
no traffic, and there were a lot of children, and everyone knew everyone, and the houses were always open, and it was paradise, I suppose, for children. It was really totally different world. Well, I mean, everywhere it was a different world.
There's an image, I think maybe Ezra Stoller, the photographer, took of you jumping off your dad's shoulders. Was it like a second floor jumping into the pool or something like that?
The house with the swimming pool that went under the house, my father would put us on his shoulders and jump into the pool. So,
Second floor.
yeah, So that's how we developed the habit of bridge jumping, I suppose.
You can see that given that Philpis was known for motorcycling across South America, although one of the details was that he sent his laundry home to Brooklyn or New Canaan or something, but motoring across South America, an adventurer. And it's obvious that, this is the father's daughter here. I was amazed just now to hear about Muffi flying without a license.
No, I think I did have a license anyway. I was getting my hours in.
She was getting her hours in with good old Carl here.
Yeah.
But before we talk about that and kind of wrap this up, how did you two meet? It was a nice story you just told me.
You want my version or her version?
Well, both.
Okay, let me back up just a minute. But one of the times when I really got to go know Shirley and Muffi and Maynard and Philip to a degree, the son, was in the 80s when they had moved back from London, Shirley and Muffi and Maynard. And one time we were having dinner with Shirley at her apartment, her house, and we had a good bit of wine, and we'd been not drinking a lot, but enough that everything was just very open in discussions. And Shirley started talking about some of these things, and I heard about the jumping off the bridge, I heard about swimming across the pass, and everybody was laughing about it. And, like we were just a moment ago. And I said, Shirley, how did you live through all this? She said, calmly, just calmly. She's going to let them go their way, and she was there when they needed her. Shirley is an amazing lady. I mean,
But
totally.
She recommended that you meet, that you call. How did you end up becoming friends?
You want your version or my version?
Let's get the Muffi
Okay,
version.
I'll go my version. Okay, Maynard had met someone from my office. He told me this last night. I didn't remember this part, but he had met someone from my office in the late 70s, and when Philip Hiss came back, his father came back to Sarasota. He was living, I think, in London or in California. I'm not sure where Phil was living, the father. And they came to my office to see some work I was doing, and then went to the site. There were 2 large Lido houses we did on the way to the beach that were just being finished. And Phil went through those with me and Maynard, and we talked a good bit about architecture. And then about 3 years later, something like that, Muffi called me and said, my father said I should take you to dinner. That's how we met.
Was that matchmaking, or was that just meeting of the minds?
Architecture meeting, okay?
Okay, well, what do you remember of that, Muffi? Plead the fifth?
I remember bumping into you at the Wildflower Restaurant on Siesta Key, but I don't remember that. But I mean, I just always remember knowing you. So.
Well, I knew you as a teenager. But that's when we were working on the studio with the living portion of his studio, because I did all the drawings for that. I was not the architect. Bert Brosmith was the architect of record, and your father was clearly the designer, there's no question, of the back portion of the studio, because I was at the meeting when that was being first discussed. So that's not Bert Brosmith, that is Philip Hiss design, Bert Brosmith, architecture of record, and me is draftsman, okay?
When you met her as a teenager, did you imagine years later, not that many years later, that she would take you flying around to look at, I think, Lido Shores, wasn't it, from above? Or tell us about that flying adventure.
The flying?
Yeah.
Oh, well, Philip is involved in this because we flew to Bimini once, and that was a wild trip. We won't go into all the details of that. But the Bimini, I didn't know, Bimini, you can almost see it when you go high enough in an airplane from Fort Lauderdale. It's so close. But it was a wild trip. Philip and you were the 2 pilots, right?
Yes, I remember they weren't letting any planes out, and Philip said, "Oh well, if we take off, that'll be okay, because then they have to vector us to Sarasota."
The father,
Yeah,
again,
my
experimental.
brother.
Yeah.
And he was a really bad storm, and we took off, and Carl got in the back and fell asleep, and we did get through the storm, but when we got to about Venice Airport, Philip said, "Why don't we frighten Carl, and I'm going to throw the canopy back, and we'll dive the plane." And I said, "God, are you crazy?"
There were others like that.
I also, what?
You also dived the plane when you were taking Carl to look, I think, at Lido Shores.
Yeah.
So tell us why you about that exploit.
Well, Muffy was getting hours, and most people wouldn't fly with her. Okay, but I was daring enough to be part of the crew there, Muffy's crew, and I wanted to take some pictures. We didn't have drones in those days. This is a long time ago, and I wanted some aerial photographs. And so Muffy took me around in a plane. Is your plane or rental plane? I don't know what it was. A small plane.
It was a two-seater airplane that had a compass. That was
Yeah,
about it.
and I would keep saying, "Lower, Muffy, lower," because I want to take pictures. And then we broke broke legal heights or something. You told me, but I just dug up some photographs the other day. I was telling her for a video from the last year's mod on my work, and we're doing a video right now. Colin is here, who did the video, beautiful video today. And so I dug up those old photographs, and I got to show Muffy the ones that were taken in probably 82 or something like that.
I don't
That's when you were flying. But there were other flying adventures more than that.
Was it often architecture-oriented?
Yes, always.
No, it wasn't.
Okay, all right.
You would go during lunch break or something, and one time I had all the charts, but you were holding the charts, and
yes,
you
okay.
spilt all your food on it. I couldn't read the charts anymore. And we would go to, because I had to land in certain airports, and we would go, and one time we were coming in, we were very late.
That was Everglades City, I think.
I don't know. I couldn't find the airport, and we were really running late, and I had to get the plane back. And so I decided I'd do a touch and go. And Carl thought we were going to land, so we came in. I touched the airport, because you had to touch the airport to say you touched the airport, and we took off again. And about 15 minutes later, Carl, who thought we were going to land there and have lunch, said, "Well, I guess you didn't like that airport." I always remember it.
Well, I mean, I don't know if this is too hard a question to ask, but clearly your sense of freedom and adventure does come from your dad, as I said. I mean, if I were to ask you what you did get from him and your mom, I mean, I think curiosity probably, but I know you spend a lot of time in Peru. I mean, anything to share in conclusion kind of about being the daughter of a man like this that we've been celebrating all weekend?
Well, I think the whole family was adventurous. I mean, my brothers being all over the place. Both of my brothers, we all lived in London. Philip took off on a sailboat for a year and sailed all over the place. No, I think the family, and my mother traveled all over the world as a child. She lived in China and Hawaii. And so I suppose the main thing that I would say I got out of him is appreciation of good architecture and curiosity.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. See, architecture is about how we inhabit it, how it informs us. It's wonderful hearing these stories about how people live in spaces that are well designed. Thank you all so much. And Shirley, thank you. It's so delightful to have you here. We're super excited to continue Mod Weekend with all of you, and thank you for being here. Take care.